All right. All right, so last time well, if you look at what we've covered so far with the nervous system, basically we've covered just the general features of it, the organization of it, the different cells that are part of the nervous system, kind of whether it's the neurons or the glial cells, just some basic information about how the nervous system works with the input, processing, and output. Second lecture, hopefully you guys have had a chance to look at it. Not sure, but it's on YouTube. And you guys got my link, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right, so we covered the brain. Obviously not a real detailed view of the brain. We're doing as best as we can, kind of considering the circumstances, but it kind of gave you an idea of how the different parts of the brain and what regions are responsible for different functions. All right, so let's go ahead and start. Let me see if I can get this view here. Okay. All right, so today the focus is initially going to be on the spinal cord. And let's kind of take a look at it, looking at the structure of the spinal cord. So of course, obviously, you know, the brain is up here. If you take a look at the spinal cord, structurally, what does it look like? Well, first of all, we can look at the spinal cord is really divided up into several different regions, and these regions correspond to the vertebrae. For example, we have up in the neck region, the spinal cord is known as the cervical region. The part of the spinal cord that's associated with where the ribs are is called the thoracic. And you notice the number of nerves that go into and out of the spinal cord at these regions. Further down, we have the lumbar region, and then the sacrum, and even one where the coccygeal nerves. So I should say, so this is the spinal cord, the different regions. With each region, we have nerves that are going to and from the spinal cord, right? And these are, remember, part of the peripheral nervous system. So if you think of the central nervous system as being the brain and the spinal cord, the nerves that are going to the brain and spinal cord and away from the brain and spinal cord are a part of the peripheral. And number-wise, you can see that we have 8 nerves that are associated with the cervical region. We have 12 nerves that are associated with the thoracic region. We have 5 nerves that are associated with the lumbar region, 5 with the sacral, and then 1 with the coccygeal. Now, if you look at the kind of the region itself going from top to bottom, one interesting thing is, even though we have this nerve going all the way down to the bottom, down to the coccygeal, you'll notice that this part, this colored area, stops at about right here. Starts up here, blue, orange, green, and then this blue. This is actually the functional end, I should say the anatomical end of the spinal cord. Now you might think, well, what about this area, lumbar and sacrum? These are nerves that are radiating out, you can see, but the spinal cord itself ends right at what we call the L2 region of this area. So it doesn't go all the way down, it ends right there. And it ends at a little cone-shaped portion called the conus medullaris. That's the name of where the spinal cord actually ends. All along the way, you notice that this area again, you notice that the thickness of it is not the same. It's somewhat thicker here than it is here. It's kind of narrow, and it's thicker up here. These thickened regions are known as enlargements. And we have up here the cervical enlargement, and down here we have the lumbar or the lumbosacral enlargement. Why is it larger here? Because in this region, we have nerves that are going to the extremities. For example, we have a lot of nerves up here that are going to the arms, a lot of nerves down here that are going to the legs, and of course, if you think of those regions, there's a lot we can do with those regions, a lot of different types of movements. So more movements requires more nerves, thereby a thickened region. This is just another view, an actual picture of the spinal cord, and you can see cervical, thoracic, different regions. I wanted to point out one other little area that of the spinal cord that's important. So here we've got the cervical enlargement. Here we've got the narrow spinal cord. And here we've got the lumbar or the lumbosacral enlargement, conus medullaris. Way down here, this area where you see these spinal nerves kind of radiating out, and I'll go back again. Kind of this area right here. This is where we see these nerves. This is called the cauda equina. The cauda equina consists of the spinal nerves that travel downwards below the spinal cord. It's called cauda equina. How many of you guys know when you think of cauda equina? When you think of equina, what word comes to mind? Any ideas? Like equine?
Equine, a horse.
Horse. So cauda equina literally means horse's tail. And if you look at it in an actual spinal area, it actually looks like the very wispy kind of all those strands of hair that are coming down. All right. Okay. So that's the longitudinal view of the spinal cord. And you can see we have like 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal pair of nerves coming down. At every one of those segments, and when I mean the segments, I mean where the C1 is, where the C2 is. If we were to take a cross section, we would find a very unique characteristic. First of all, there's 31 segments if you wanted to actually count. So we have 31 segments from top to bottom, counting all those nerves, because that's 8 plus 12, that's 20, plus 5 of the lumbar, that's 25, plus another 5 of the sacrum, that's 30, plus the coccygeal, that's 31. At each segment, this is our transverse view of the spinal cord. And at each segment, we have a couple structures. One that's called the dorsal root, which is this area, which consists of nerves that are going into the spinal cord. Along the way, we have the swollen portion called the dorsal root ganglia. So in some textbooks, you might see it listed as posterior root or as posterior root ganglion. It means exactly the same thing. So what is this? The dorsal root consists of sensory nerves that are entering into the spinal cord. Axons, really. The dorsal root ganglia consists of cell bodies of the nerves. So we have axons and cell bodies coming in, or actually at this area, and they eventually make their way into the interior of the spinal cord.
Bandito's right there.
We also have what's known as the ventral root. The ventral root, or sometimes called the anterior root, consists of nerves that are leaving the spinal cord. So of course, that would be motor nerves. So sensory nerves enter into the spinal cord by way of the dorsal root. Ventral nerve or motor nerves leave by way of the ventral root. And you see that in every one of the 31 segments. Okay. So this is just kind of another view so you can see the cauda equina. So if you look at all, again, those that break up, when you get down to the very bottom, we have what's called the cauda equina, which is this, just another view of what I was just saying. So that would be like the conus medullaris right there. And all these nerves, this is not spinal cord. These are just nerves that are spinal nerves that are radiating out. Some are coming in through the dorsal root, some are leaving through the ventral root. All right. So to kind of examine that a little bit further, the dorsal root consists of axons of sensory neurons. And what I recorded last time, of course, was that sensory neurons are structurally, they're unipolar. So if you go back to that lecture, you'll see unipolar neurons are consist of a cell body with one, with a small little branch going in both directions. You'll have to look at the previous lecture, but whenever you hear of sensory neurons, they're always going to be unipolar. That's just their shape. The dorsal root ganglion consists of cell bodies of those same sensory, or if you want to think of a similar term, the afferent nerves. The ventral root consists of motor nerves, as I mentioned before, which are multipolar. So motor nerves are called multipolar based on their shape. Sensory neurons are called unipolar because of their shape. All right. So this is going to be kind of a throwback to our discussion on the vertebrae, actually in lab, bones. Remember when we were looking at the vertebrae, you noticed where the vertebrae came together, there was a little space created. And this is known as the intervertebral foramen. That foramen, the importance of it is that's where the nerves via the dorsal root as well as the ventral root enter into the spinal cord. So that foramen obviously is very important. And if that gets bone spurs or narrowing, that's going to cause an inflammation of those nerves because they're getting pinched. You can see right here, here's the sensory nerves, and here is the motor nerves, but you can see there's a point where they join. It almost looks like, you can't see it all, but they do join. You have sensory nerves going in this way and motor nerves going this way. And then they're one nerve right there. That's known as the spinal nerve. And we often call that a mixed nerve. The reason why we call it mixed is because if you look at this next diagram, here we've got the sensory neurons going this way. This would be the spinal nerve, which is mixed. And here we've got the motor neurons here. I like to think of this as kind of like a freeway. You've got northbound traffic, or if you want to say eastbound traffic here, westbound traffic here, maybe the highway divides and all eastbound traffic is going up there, all westbound traffic is down there. But it's called a mixed nerve because there's both sensory and motor nerves there. And that's what you're seeing right there. All right, so I've mentioned to you the nerves that are going into and leaving the spinal cord, right? Here's the ventral root and here's the dorsal root. And you can always tell the difference. It's only the dorsal root that's going to have this ganglion. The ventral root does not have a ganglion. But what about the spinal cord itself? What is it? What are the different parts? You can see we kind of have this butterfly region. Okay, well, when you take a look at the spinal cord, you can see that it's partially divided, right? You can see, remember with the brain, we have the longitudinal fissure with the corpus callosum. The spinal cord is partially divided. We have what's known as the anterior median fissure, which divides it on the ventral side, and the posterior median fissure, which divides it on the dorsal side. This area that looks like a butterfly is what we call the horns of the spinal cord. This area down here that's kind of highlighted in, I don't know, kind of orange or pink, this is called the anterior or ventral gray horn. The reason for that is, of course, it's on the ventral side, but also this is where the nerves that are leaving by way of the ventral root originate from. You can kind of see this here. So anterior horn, anterior root. On the other side, we have the posterior gray horn, and this is where the sensory nerves enter into the spinal cord. So there's a distinct mapping of the spinal cord. There is a third area called the lateral horn, and this is going to be important for when we start talking about the autonomic nervous system a little bit later this morning. If you remember the peripheral nervous system is divided up into the somatic branch, right, which consists of nerves that are going to the skeletal muscle. This would be like this. And then it also consists of the autonomic nervous system, which consists of nerves that are going to the internal organs. And these nerves originate here. You don't actually see the spinal nerves like you see here, but they are there. They just come out differently. So autonomic neurons originate from the lateral horn, and we'll talk about these terms, T1 to L2 in a second. Whereas nerves that are going to the skeletal muscle originate here. Nerves that are going into the spinal cord, sensory nerves, enter into the dorsal region. So if you think about it, say if you touch something hot, right, nerves are going to go into the spinal cord and then via the sensory nerves, and then your motor nerves are going to trigger a response in which you move your hand down here. The right and left sides, if you can kind of see it, here's the left side of the spinal cord, the right side. The horns are connected by what's called the gray commissure. I do want to mention that even though it's not shown here, that it's a mirror image. So we have a posterior horn there on the right, posterior horn on the left, an anterior horn and lateral horn over there as well. And the same thing with these nerves. In the middle of the spinal cord, we have what's known as the central canal, which is where cerebral spinal fluid circulates through. All right. So we've got the horns, which is this butterfly area, but what about this outer kind of white colored region? These are called columns, and we have, the names are kind of very similar to the horns in the sense we have posterior, lateral, and anterior gray horns. We also have posterior column, lateral column, and anterior column. So why are they colored differently? What's the difference? Well, the horns consist primarily of cell bodies, dendrites and cell bodies, whereas the column consists of myelinated axons, and myelin gives axons a whitish color. So these are the axons in the column. The horns are the cell bodies. And what we'll soon see is these columns, if you can kind of picture them coming out towards you, these are the highways that carry information to and from the brain, between the brain and the spinal cord. All right. Here's an actual photomicrograph of the spinal cord, and you can see it here. Here you've got all the gray matter, even though it's all blue, but it's gray matter. Central canal, gray commissure. This is all white matter. It's white just because that's the type of stain that they used. So you can see that very interesting little butterfly or bow tie type of appearance. Sensory nerves come in here on the dorsal side. Motor nerves leave here from the ventral side. So it's a very distinct, very repetitive mapping. All right. So this is actually a nice, I like to put this image in there because it shows the relationship between the spinal cord and the vertebrae. If you remember way back when we were talking about vertebrae, remember those two bifid spinous process that's characteristic of the cervical vertebrae. Remember that? All right, so this is the spinal cord. Here we've got the dorsal root ganglion. This is the dorsal root. This is the ventral root. And this, of course, is the gray matter where the horns are. And this is actually the columns. What this also shows are what we call the meninges. And I spoke about that in the brain lecture, the meninges. These are layers of tissue that surround the brain and spinal cord. We have 3 layers of them. The outermost layer, and I've got a better picture of this, the outermost layer is known as the dura mater. The middle layer is known as the arachnoid. It got its name because it kind of has a spidery appearance. And the innermost layer is the pia mater, that literally is in contact with the spinal cord itself. We've got other spaces in here. We'll talk about those in a little bit between these different layers. So these are very important. We have fluid that travels through these layers, but just know for now, there's 3 layers that wrap the brain and also wrap the spinal cord. This is just a repetitive picture. This is, of course, what we're looking at on this diagram. This is just another view of the spinal cord. If you're wondering what the heck this is, this is the gray matter, what this thing that they call the funiculus. Again, as you know from anatomy, there's often more than one way of saying the same thing. Funiculus is the same thing as column. All right, so one of the interesting things about well, I wouldn't call it interesting, but one aspect of how anesthesia works, some of you have experienced it yourself, some you may have known family members that have had it. There's 2 different types of anesthesia, and a lot of it has to do with, I should say, 2 different types of anesthesia delivery. Depends on where it's injected. We have what we call spinal and epidural. If you look outside there's the spinal cord, these are the meninges, a little bit closer up, right? This yellow area, this is the epidural region, where this is all fat. If someone gets an epidural injection, it goes right into that fatty layer. And as you'll see on this video I'm going to show you, because it's located in the fat, it's a little far away from the spinal cord, so it takes a little while for it to trickle in. So once you have an injection of epidural anesthesia, you won't feel the effect right away, but once you do, it'll last a while by the time it reaches the spinal cord. In contrast, spinal anesthesia actually goes through the epidural fat, just actually underneath the dura, very close to the spinal cord. Of course, the doctors have to be very careful about that. It's closer to the spinal cord, which means that it'll take effect much quicker, but it won't last as long. So let me show you a quick little video of this, and you let me know. Hopefully, you'll see it. All right. Oh, that's not what. That's an what? No, I don't want an ad. No, why did this do this to me? Skip ad. There you go. Can you guys see this okay?
No.
No,
Yes.
I see something. No.
I just see the PowerPoint.
Oh, wow. Okay, hold on a second. Stop share.
epidural anesthesia
let me
are also
share
often
screen.
used during childbirth. Both spinal and epidural anesthesia involve injecting medication
Do you see
into the
that?
spinal cord
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
to numb from the level of your chest down to your feet.
let me start this over
Advantages
again.
of spinal and epidural anesthesia, such as pelvic, hip, or leg surgery, you may be able to avoid general anesthesia by having your operation under spinal or epidural anesthesia instead. Spinal and epidural anesthesia are also often used during childbirth. Both spinal and epidural anesthesia involve injecting medications near the spinal cord. This makes you numb from the level of your chest down to your feet. Advantages of spinal and epidural anesthesia include the ability to be awake during the operation and to avoid the risks associated with general anesthesia. Because spinal and epidural anesthesia rarely cause decreases in blood pressure and other changes that might require rapid treatment, you will have an intravenous line in place.
This is just extra stuff, obviously.
Can be administered quickly. You will also be connected to various monitors to keep track of your blood pressure, pulse, and the oxygen content of your blood. Prior to receiving spinal or epidural anesthesia, the anesthetist will use an antiseptic solution to clean the area of your back where the medicine is injected. To decrease pain from the needle stick, he or she may instill a local anesthetic directly over the spot where the spinal or epidural needle will be inserted. Spinal anesthesia involves a single injection of medication into the sac of fluid that surrounds your spinal cord. To reach this fluid sac, the anesthetist will pass a needle through your skin, between the vertebral bones, and finally, through spinal ligaments and the dura, which is the protective membrane around your spinal cord. Spinal anesthesia begins working almost immediately after the injection is completed. With epidural anesthesia, the needle does not penetrate the dura, and medication is deposited just outside of the sac of fluid that surrounds your spinal cord. Epidural anesthesia may be given in a single dose, or the anesthetist may leave a tiny, flexible tube or catheter in place in the event more anesthetic is required during a longer than expected procedure. Epidural anesthesia takes about 10 minutes to begin working. After the injection of spinal anesthesia or the removal of an epidural catheter, a small bandage will be placed over the area where the needle was inserted. After spinal
All right, I'm gonna
anesthesia,
see.
you will be kept in bed with your head flat
Let's see.
for several hours.
All right. Stop that. Okay. Let's see here. Stop share. Let me go back here to share again. So what's interesting, if you look at that picture that they showed you, you saw it looked like the spinal cord with several different, it wasn't just one structure like that, it was several. And that's because typically with the anesthesia, they actually give the injection a little bit below. In fact, they do give it sometimes right where the cauda equina is, where the nerves are, as opposed to right into where the spinal cord. So that's kind of a less risky way to do it. Okay. So, all right, let me just stop share for a second. Hold on 1 second here. Go back to share screen again. And here we go. And share. Okay. Why is that not going here? Let's see. That's weird. There we go. Okay. So this is just another view of the spinal cord. Remember I mentioned there's meninges that surround the spinal cord as they do the brain. Here you can see this is the dura mater, there's the arachnoid, and there's the pia mater, right? So these three layers are very important, and obviously in terms of protection of the spinal cord itself. And you also see those with the brain. All right, so we've spoken a lot about the spinal cord, which is this area, and you can see where it ends, right around the L2 area, and then we have the cauda equina. But now I want to talk about these spinal nerves that go to the spinal cord and away from the spinal cord, to different regions. And one of the things that you'll see is that they're divided up into very distinct groupings. Okay. The spinal nerves consist of 31 pair, as you already know, right? There's 8, 12, 5, 5, and 1. If you take a look at the spinal nerves that are leaving and entering the spinal cord, you notice that although some of them, it looks like there's one nerve, many of them, it looks like there's like a web or a group of them, like right up in this area, excuse me, and down in this area. These are called plexuses, and we'll talk about these. All right, so there's an intraweaving, and you notice this intraweaving is primarily associated with where we have the leg and where we have the arm, and there's a very important significance of that. So spinal nerves can either be sensory or motor, as you might expect, right? Sensory, of course, are going to come into the dorsal, through the dorsal root. Motor ones are going to leave through the ventral root. All right, so with the spinal nerves, like I said, they're divided up mostly into 4 major plexuses, or this like interweaving. We have what's called the cervical plexus, which is way up on top here. We have what's called the brachial plexus. We have this area down here where the thoracic vertebrae are, where there is no plexus. And then we have the lumbar and the sacral plexus. So you can see here's a list of some very specific nerves that are associated with the different plexuses, and we'll talk about those individually. All right. So what part of the cervical region do we have the cervical plexus? Primarily between the C1 to C5 region. So remember there's 8 cervical nerves. The first 5 are part of the cervical plexus. And the main one, so I want you to know specific nerves that are part of this region. So the main nerve that's associated with the cervical plexus is known as the phrenic nerve. We'll learn a lot about this when we start talking about the respiratory system, because this is the nerve that innervates the diaphragm, which, as all of you guys know, is a very important, well, necessary muscle for breathing. So the phrenic nerve is important and it innervates the diaphragm. The brachial plexus, there are other nerves, but that's the one I want you to know. Within the brachial plexus, which goes from C5 to T1, that consists of these nerves right here, the axillary, median, ulnar, and radial. Now, with names like ulnar, radial, and things like that, what part of the body do you think those nerves go to and from? Anyone?
The upper extremities.
Exactly. Median, ulnar, and radial, and also the armpit axillary. Then we have the lumbar plexus, which starts at T12, goes to L4. This is where we have the femoral nerve, which goes down the front of the leg. Other nerves as well, but again, that's the main one. And then we have the sacral plexus, where we have the sciatic nerve, which I'm sure most, if not all of you guys have heard of. Some of you are very aware of it because you have sciatic nerve pain sometime in your life. But anyway, that's the largest nerve in the body. You notice between T1 and T12, there's nothing. There's T1, what about T2 to T11? There's no plexus there. That's where we have the intercostal nerves that are going to the intercostal muscles. You learned about those in the muscle section. All right. So now let's go through some of the individual plexuses. We'll go through this rather quickly. Cervical plexus, just like any plexus or spinal nerve, consists of mixed nerves. The main nerve, it's part of the cervical plexus, is the phrenic nerve. And you can actually see it right there. This is the phrenic nerve. If I don't mention the other nerves, you don't have to know about them. But so just know the phrenic nerve associated with the cervical plexus, and that goes to the diaphragm. What about the motor nerves? I'm sorry, what about the brachial plexus? The brachial plexus, as you can see right here, where it's located below the cervical plexus, here we've got several very important nerves, and they all eventually they work their way to the upper extremities, the median nerves, the ulnar, the radial, the axillary, as well as the musculocutaneous. All of these are nerves that go through into this area. And if any of you guys have ever had issues with, I don't know, like rotator cuff or some inflammation below the clavicle, you know how that affects your arm. You can get kind of a numbing due to the pressure on these nerves. Speaking of one of these nerves, the ulnar, which is this one, the ulnar nerve is also what's responsible for that lovely sensation you get when you bang your elbow on a table, right? That's creates the funny bone sensation. What about the median nerve? The median nerve travels down, of course, the ventral surface, I should say really the anterior surface of your arm into your hand. You can see it eventually branches off into these other nerves into your digits. Well, the median nerve is the one that's the culprit that's responsible for if you have carpal tunnel syndrome. You see this nerve travels underneath what's called the transverse carpal ligament, creates kind of like a tunnel. That's the tunnel they talk about. So if you have carpal tunnel syndrome, this nerve is inflamed. So what doctors typically have to do, they have to cut at least part of this ligament to relieve the pressure on that nerve. Yeah, my wife had carpal tunnel surgery. It works. It's kind of painful though, but it's better than the alternative. All right, then we have the lumbar plexus. Lumbar plexus goes actually down the anterior and medial surface of the leg and foot. And the big nerve that you want to know with this is the femoral nerve. Then we have the sacral plexus, which of course the main nerve that I mentioned is the sciatic, right? And this is the sacral plexus. This is the sciatic nerve. But what I do want to mention is that it's only called the sciatic for part of the way. As you get down into your tibia and fibula, this nerve branches off into what's called the tibial and the common peroneal, or you could say common fibular. So the sciatic branches off into the fibular and the tibial nerve. Okay. So you guys still with me? Any questions?
Okay.
No? Okay. All right. Let me just go back for a second. Stop the share. Let me go back to the main screen. Let me see if anyone has any questions. All right. No one has any questions? You guys are good right now?
No questions.
No questions.
Okay. All right. Let's go back now to, yeah. Okay. So I mentioned before that the columns of the spine, remember in the spinal cord, we have the gray matter and we have the white matter. And the white matter are called columns or funiculi. Remember I mentioned we have posterior, lateral, and anterior. Well, those nerves, the axons that are found in the columns go up to the brain, and some of those nerves actually go from the brain to the spinal cord. So it's like a north-south movement. The nerves that are going up to the brain are known as ascending tracts, kind of makes sense, right? And you can see right here, this is kind of an interesting example. This case, this person touched a rose or touched the thorn. Nerves travel from the spinal cord and then they eventually go up to the brain. And at least in the case with this, because it's kind of painful, it hurts, right? So these are ascending. Descending tracks carry motor information from the brain back down. So say if you touch that thorn and then you move your hand out of the way, right? You're moving muscle, and that's because of instructions from these motor nerves. Notice the interesting thing about the location of these nerve tracks. You notice here's where the ascending nerve tracks go to this area. And you notice this is where the motor nerves leads from. This would be in the, for example, in the parietal lobe. Remember I mentioned we have the sensory cortex with the homunculus where nerves come in. And in the frontal lobe, this is where motor nerves lead from. All right. Why is this doing this to me? Let's try that again. All right, oops. Yeah. Okay, so we have sensory and motor pathways. What do I want you to know about them? We have different ones. There's primarily 3 sensory pathways. They're known as the posterior column, the spinal thalamic, and the spinal cerebellar. And one way you can remember that I used to remember that they're sensory, notice at least with these two, the spinal part is in the front of the word, like they're going from the spine to the thalamus, spine to the cerebellum. This one doesn't say it, but you just have to memorize that. So these are the 3 pathways, 3 groupings that are part of the ascending track. These 2 are part of the descending tract. And what do I want you to know about this? Well, with the motor pathway, the nerves are responsible for controlling muscle function. Corticospinal is conscious control. The medial and lateral pathways are subconscious. You notice a lot of times, when we're walking, we initially think of walking, but then we're basically subconscious. We don't think of every single step that we're doing, right? So in contrast with the sensory, these the posterior column and the spinal thalamic are both involved in conveying sensations of touch, pressure, pain, all the way up to the primary sensory cortex. So when you touch something, when you feel pressure on your skin, if you're feeling pain or temperature, signals are delivered by these 2 different pathways all the way up. So that's when you sense that, there's a sensation you have. This one down here, the spinal cerebellar, is responsible for motor coordination, the positions of muscles. So basically making sure our muscle movement is well coordinated as opposed to very choppy. This is just a picture showing, I'm not going to ask you any details of this, but you can see these nerves are going up, they're both going up. And these are pictures showing nerves that are going down. Now, one of the things I wanted to mention is that in these pathways, you notice especially right here, you notice where the nerves that are coming down, for the most part, they stay on the same side. Like here's the left side of the brain, here's the left side of the spinal cord. But then there's a time when these nerves will cross over. Where they cross over is called the decussation of pyramids, or the pyramidal decussation. So how does this play out? Well, if you've ever known anyone that's had a stroke that affects the right side of their body, typically the stroke is on the left side of their brain. So that's when you talk about the left side controlling the right, that's how we see it right here. These nerves actually cross over in what's called in the corticospinal tract, creating what we call the decussation, or the crossing over. All right. All right, so we're on the home stretch of this lecture. Then we'll pause for a second and then we'll do the autonomic. I've spoken about spinal nerves, right? Nerves that are going to and from the spinal cord and those different plexuses. Well, there's also nerves that are going to and from the brain. And these are called cranial nerves. This is obviously a ventral view of the brain. There are 12 pairs of nerves as opposed to with the spinal cord, remember there's 31, right? There's 12 pairs of nerves. In the case of the brain, the 12 pairs of nerves have names. They're known as cranial nerve 1, cranial nerve 2, 3, right? You can count them all the way up to 12. Now, besides the I should say the number, so there's a cranial nerve number, they also have a name. And you need to know both the name and the number of them. So for example, cranial nerve 1 is also known as the olfactory nerve. The olfactory nerve, as you might expect, is responsible for bringing the sensation of smell into the brain. Cranial nerve 2 is the optic nerve. What do you think the function is of this nerve? Any thoughts?
Or vision.
Vision, exactly. This is what brings, like when you look at something with light, this is what brings the visual sensation into the brain, exactly. Cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6, I'm going to group them together, 3, 4, and 6. I mean, the oculomotor, trochlear, and abducens, these are all nerves that are responsible for controlling the eye muscles. So when you look to the left, your eyes turn to the left, right, up, down, things like that. Those muscles are under the control of these 3 nerves, the oculomotor, the trochlear, and the abducens. Okay. Now, just to talk about, when we're talking about sensory and motor nerves, olfactory and optic, because they're bringing information into the brain, they are both sensory. Optic and olfactory, they're both sensory. Cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6, because they're controlling muscles, they are motor. 3, 4, and 6. Cranial nerve 5 is a mixed nerve, meaning it has both motor and sensory functions, and this controls some of the facial muscles, primarily the jaw muscles, some aspects of the face, so that carry sensation in and out. It's mixed. So in other words, if someone has a really bad tooth pain, really bad, quite often it can be due to like an overstimulated trigeminal nerve. So trigeminal nerve is a mixed nerve. Facial nerve is what's responsible for controlling, all those different facial expression muscles like the zygomaticus, right? The frontalis muscles, all those different muscles, those are all under the control of the facial nerve. Lot of muscles. Cranial nerve 8 is acoustic. So what do you think acoustic, what sense do you think that's involved with?
Your voice?
That's a good thought, actually, and in a way it is, but it's the sensation of hearing. So when so it's a voice or a sound. This is what carries information, basically from. This is a sensory nerve that carries information from the ear to the brain. So that's also sensory, much like the optic nerve. What about cranial nerve 9? 9 and 10, these are very important nerves. Basically, glossopharyngeal controls some aspects of tongue movement. And it also, strangely enough, also is responsible for conveying information on what they call chemoreceptors, basically information about the oxygen content in our blood. It conveys that to the brain. And we'll learn more about that a little bit later. Vagus nerve, we'll learn about that. Vagus nerve is actually the really incredible nerve. It controls everything from digestive function to cardiovascular function. This is also a mixed nerve. So both vagus and glossopharyngeal are both mixed nerves. Spinal accessory nerve, this is actually what's responsible for controlling the muscles such as the sternocleidomastoid muscle. That's the spinal accessory nerve.
Wait, can you repeat that? It does what?
Yeah, spinal accessory nerve, or the accessory nerve, controls function of the sternocleidomastoid muscle. All right. Finally, we have the hypoglossal nerve, which is also, but by the name glosso, that refers to tongue. This actually, whereas the glossopharyngeal controls the anterior portion of the tongue, hypoglossal actually controls the posterior part of the tongue. So it's interesting. Two separate innervations. All right, so this is, I just put these pictures in just so you can see them. The view of these nerves, what part of the body they go to. This is kind of neat right here. This you can see cranial nerves 1 comes from the nose. Cranial nerve 2 comes from the eye as far as for vision. Cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6 all supply the muscles of the eye. Cranial nerve 5, the trigeminal, controls different parts of the face, basically the jaw. Sometimes people have really bad headaches, right? They sometimes will have an overactivation of the trigeminal nerve. Cranial nerve 7, as you can see, just covers all the facial expression muscles. Cranial nerve 8, this is the ear. Cranial nerve 9, I mentioned, is part of the tongue. And cranial nerve 12 is the other part of the tongue. They both actually control the tongue, even though you can't see it really clearly. Cranial nerve 11, as you can see, controlling muscles such as the sternocleidomastoid muscle. And cranial nerve 10, as you can see, this controls respiratory, digestive, cardiovascular function. This is actually an overview of it. And what I want you to get from this, I know it might look overwhelming, but I want you to understand a couple of things. First of all, I want you to know the names of the nerves, right, with their optic, olfactory, whatever. I want you to know whether they're sensory, motor, or mixed, and their general function, like I mentioned. Like you can see right here, oculomotor controls the different eye muscles. Now it specifies which eye muscles. Don't worry about that. Just know that these 3 control the eye muscles. And yeah, you can kind of tell that they're mixed, which ones are mixed, motor or sensory, by the color. So blue indicates sensory, right? You can see pink basically is motor. There's part of it that are motor, part of it's mixed. Here you can see cranial nerve 9 is mixed. Cranial nerve 10 is mixed. Cranial nerve 11 is just motor, and it'll actually say on there. All right. So that takes us to the end of the covering the spinal nerves. So we've gotten through three of the 4 lectures. What I was going to go ahead and do, unless anyone has any questions about this last lecture, is to jump right in and do the autonomic nervous system. And then what I was going to do, I'll just make a short video, because I know everyone's got their own schedules, making a short video of my review for the exam, if that's okay with everybody. Just like a separate video that I'll just send to you. Will that work?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. All right. So let's jump into the autonomic. If I can find it somewhere here, let's go. I know where to find it. It's the autonomic newest. All right. And I don't need to do that. All right. All right, let me go back to this for a second. All right, now we're going to share, and we're going to share. Okay, here we go. I'm slowly figuring this thing out. Okay. Let's see, let me try that again. All right. Okay, so first of all, I like to do overviews. So let's take a look at the overview of the nervous system. So remember, we've got the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. We've got the peripheral nervous system, which is divided up into both the somatic branch, which goes to skeletal muscles, right? And then we have the autonomic branch, which goes to the internal organs. The peripheral nervous system involves those spinal nerves and cranial nerves that we were just talking about in different ways. All right. So this is kind of another description, kind of a little flow chart. Here you can see that the peripheral nervous system receives information via sensory nerves, and then the output, the motor part, is either somatic, which goes to skeletal muscle, or it's autonomic, which goes to the internal organs, and that's divided up into the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. And this is going to be our focus today. Sometimes you'll hear the term visceral. Visceral corresponds to the autonomic, and somatic corresponds to the somatic, as you might expect. All right. So just to kind of revisit a little bit, when we talk about the peripheral nervous system, I mentioned we have the somatic branch and the autonomic branch. With the somatic branch, what I wanted to mention is that once the nerves leave the spinal cord to innervate a muscle, there's a single nerve that goes to a muscle. I don't want you to worry about what it talks about first order or second order motor neurons. Just know that that's in the spinal cord. What comes out of the spinal cord is one nerve, and this goes to skeletal muscle. The reason why I'm saying one nerve is because when we look at the autonomic nervous system, we're going to see more than one nerve. We're going to see 2 nerves. All right. This is just kind of an interesting picture I threw in there. Just actually, it probably doesn't even really belong with this lecture, but just as it's kind of a neat thing to show you. This is showing sensory neurons coming from the dorsal root, going up to the brain, right? And these are ventral nerves coming out through the ventral root. Okay. All right, so let's kind of again compare before we jump into the autonomic. This is the somatic branch, where you have a single nerve that leaves the spinal cord that's going to stimulate a muscle. One motor nerve, that's it. So that's just to kind of plant the seed, somatic nervous system, innervates muscle. There's a single nerve that comes out from the spinal cord or the cranial nerves that go to that muscle. This is where we're going to see the difference, one of many differences with the autonomic nervous system. So first of all, what is the autonomic nervous system? You know, it's part of the peripheral nervous system. It consists of two parts, the parasympathetic branch and the sympathetic branch, which primarily have opposing effects, opposite effects to each other, how they regulate organs. The autonomic nervous system is very complex, but if I were to summarize it, I would say that it's involved in the adaptation to environmental changes. Now, when I say environmental changes, I'm not talking about, climate changes, changes in other aspects. I'm talking about internal environment. So for example, when you bring food into your body, right, that's the environment is changing, right? Your body has to respond. When you're dehydrated, your body responds. That's a change in the environment. When you have too much salt in your body, when you're stressed, right? We're responding to an environment, and most organ systems are affected. This is just showing, this is the sympathetic and this is the parasympathetic. All right. So basically, the autonomic nervous system involves motor regulation. So if you think of motor, we're talking about efferent nerves that are going to regulate. We talk about smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is just kind of another way of saying all internal organs, because really all internal organs, even the respiratory tract, digestive tract, urinary tract, reproductive tract, they consist of smooth muscle. Cardiac muscle, glands, adipose tissue. The autonomic nervous system consists of nerves that regulate basically all the internal organs, and we call them visceral effectors. Visceral, again, is the opposite of somatic. Somatic refers to skeletal muscle. Visceral refers to all the other internal organs. So this is an efferent pathway, right? Much like somatic, right? Those nerves are going to skeletal muscle. We have two branches, right? We have the sympathetic division, which is fight or flight, and we have parasympathetic rest and digest. So what exactly does that mean? Well, it's kind of a general way of saying kind of how they respond. If you think of your body, how you respond to a stressful situation, we call that fight or flight, right? Some of the things that you would see with the sympathetic division would be your heart rate, maybe your breathing rate would go up, you would sweat, things like that. Whereas the parasympathetic kind of calms things down. We call it rest and digest. So there's this neat little homeostasis, this kind of a counterbalance between the two systems. Most organs are affected by both sympathetic and parasympathetic. If one excites that organ, the other inhibits it. So I would say most organs are affected by both. There's only a few that are not. And do I have it there? No, I don't. The only ones that don't really receive dual innervation would be sweat glands, which only are stimulated by the sympathetic system, and blood vessels, which are only affected by the sympathetic. So everything else responds to both sympathetic and parasympathetic. All right. Okay, so let's take a look at the sympathetic pathway, the motor pathway, and to see how it compares to the somatic branch. So if you remember the diagram, this is of course the spinal cord, and this would be a target organ. We can call that a visceral effector, whether it's the heart, lungs, digestive tract. One of the first things I hope you see is the fact that instead of just having one nerve going from the spinal cord to the heart, we have two. That's characteristic of the autonomic nervous system. We have two sets of motor neurons. The first one is called preganglionic, and it comes from the lateral gray horn. Remember that? Whereas the somatic, it comes from the ventral. We have a preganglionic neuron that synapses or interacts with a postganglionic neuron. And it's that postganglionic neuron that's going to either stimulate or inhibit the heart, depending on whether it's sympathetic or parasympathetic. So that's the first thing to recognize, two sets of neurons. So this is kind of what we're looking at, the basic organization. Here you've got the brain or spinal cord, preganglionic, where it's synapses is just called a ganglion. And then we've got postganglionic, which goes to the target organ. So this is really the formula for any part of the autonomic nervous system. There's a couple exceptions, of course, that I will talk about. Okay, so again, this is just to compare. Somatic pathway has a single nerve that goes to the muscle. Remember, just one. Whereas back to the autonomic, we have two. So just wanted to drill that in. All right. Remember I mentioned that the autonomic nervous system, most organs have dual input, dual control. The exception are blood vessels and sweat glands. Don't worry about this part on this left here, just this. Both these organs are only affected by the sympathetic nervous system. So when the blood vessels will dilate, you know, say if it's hot outside and your skin gets red, they'll dilate or they constrict, or when you sweat, that's all under the control of the sympathetic. All right. Okay. So I know it's kind of a small picture, unfortunately, but hopefully I'll kind of make it clear. So we have these two branches. We have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So if we have two branches, first of all, where do the nerves originate from? Well, I already mentioned from the central nervous system, but if you take a look carefully, the nerves that are part of the sympathetic pathway are found in a different part of the spinal cord than nerves that are part of the parasympathetic. The sympathetic nerves, or the nerves that are going to go part of the sympathetic pathway, originate in what we call the thoracolumbar region of the spinal cord. And that name really speaks volumes, right? It's in the thoracic lumbar area. They refer to it as from T1 to L2. Oops, T1 to L2. And you can see, for example, here we've got a single neuron. There's the preganglionic neuron. And there is the postganglionic neuron, right? The adrenal medulla, we're going to ignore that. That's kind of what I mentioned. There's an exception to the rule. So let's just kind of focus on just the regular, the normal pathway. So we've got preganglionic, postganglionic, sympathetic. With the parasympathetic, the nerves originate from the sacral region, S1, S2 to S4, and also the cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10. So you can see there's a distinct mapping difference of where those nerves originate from. So that's the first key difference. Second of all, has to do with the size of the pre and post ganglionic neurons. And hopefully you can tell from here, we've got here's the preganglionic in the sympathetic, here's the postganglionic, and you can see that the preganglionic relative to the post is very short. Postganglionic is long. With the parasympathetic pathway, it's the exact opposite. The preganglionic neuron is very, very long, and the postganglionic is very short. So that's another difference. And we'll discuss a few other differences coming up. All right. So as long as you're talking about differences, let's kind of do a little side-by-side comparison. One of the things that's often referred to with the autonomic nervous system is we call them the rule of twos, the number two. there are two divisions. We have sympathetic and parasympathetic, right? 1 and 2. Each division arises from 2 regions, right? The sympathetic is from the thoracolumbar region. The parasympathetic is from the cranial sacral region. Third, each pathway has 2 neurons, right? We have a preganglionic and a postganglionic. Preganglionic, postganglionic. Preganglionic, postganglionic. So those are the system of 2s. 2 regions, thoracolumbar versus craniosacral, 2 divisions, sympathetic, parasympathetic, and each of those divisions has 2 neurons in their chain. A couple other differences. So let's focus right now on just the sympathetic division. So now we're going to kind of do a kind of divide it up. Sympathetic division is known, as I mentioned, as the fight or flight. One of the other differences between the two, between sympathetic and parasympathetic, has to do with the nature of their neurotransmitters, right? Anyone remember what neurotransmitter is used to stimulate skeletal muscle contraction?
Acetylcholine.
Awesome, very good. In the case of the sympathetic system, we have the preganglionic neurons release acetylcholine, much like with the somatic pathway, but the postganglionic neurons that reach the target organ produce norepinephrine. I kind of abbreviate it as norepi, but it's known as norepinephrine. So 2 neuron chain, each neuron produces a different neurotransmitter. All right. Yeah, I'm gonna skip this slide. We'll skip this one. All right. So to kind of look again a little bit, here is another diagram that I found was kind of cool. Here is the sympathetic division. Here we've got a short preganglionic neuron in blue, a long postganglionic neuron in red. Remember this neuron, the pre produces acetylcholine, the post produces norepinephrine. This is just another view of it. Now, again, kind of repetitive, but just wanted to put different ones. So remember, thoracic neurons originate from the T1 to the L2 region, right? And they're going to all these different organs. All right, so that's the way it is with all of the organs that are receiving input from the sympathetic nervous system, right? They're all receiving, there's a preganglionic, a postganglionic. Preganglionic produces acetylcholine, postganglionic produces norepinephrine, the target organ's affected. With the involvement of the adrenal medulla, which is part of the adrenal gland, this organ has a different relationship with the sympathetic system. First of all, where is the adrenal medulla? It sits on top of the kidney. This is the adrenal medulla. So if you remember our typical pathway, right, we have a short preganglionic neuron and a long postganglionic neuron. With the adrenal medulla, it's very, very different. We have a preganglionic neuron. Instead of being short, it goes all the way to the adrenal gland, where it directly stimulates cells of the adrenal gland called chromaffin cells. You can see it right here, chromaffin cells. These chromaffin cells respond by producing norepinephrine, like we saw before, as well as epinephrine into the blood. Of course, once that neurotransmitter gets into the blood, obviously it's going to go throughout the entire body, which in the case of the sympathetic system, this is why the entire body is pretty much mobilized with the fight or flight, right? From your head to your toes, you're affected. All right, so just to compare, Normally with sympathetic, we have the preganglionic, forms a ganglion, then we produces acetylcholine. Postganglionic goes to the organ, triggers the release of norepinephrine. In this case, we have this one long preganglionic neuron that goes right to the adrenal gland, triggers these cells called chromaffin cells to produce epinephrine and norepinephrine, which goes into the blood, which then becomes systemic. All right. So there are certain conditions that can arise from abnormalities or overactivation of the sympathetic system. I'm just going to mention a couple. First one is actually a tumor of the adrenal medulla. If you think the adrenal medulla produces norepinephrine and epinephrine, if someone has a tumor of this gland, they're just producing, instead of just producing it when we need it, it's producing it constantly. So if you think of a constant fight or flight response, heart palpitations, right? Sweating, anxiety, increased blood pressure, constantly, not a really good situation. The only real way to treat it, one of my former students had this, is they actually had to go in surgically and remove the tumor. So it's basically it's an exaggerated response. It's an exaggerated stress response that's going on all the time, which is not a way to live, really. It'd be very difficult. The other involvement of the sympathetic system is what we call, I shouldn't say is the role of, but the response to anaphylactic shock. So we haven't spoken about anaphylactic shock. Anaphylactic shock is a very severe allergic reaction. Some of you guys have experienced this before. Maybe you know of someone that has. And this can lead to constriction of the bronchioles, blood vessels dilate, life-threatening drop in blood pressure. It can lead to a lot of life-threatening situations. Blood pressure drops, things like that. So one of the treatments for anaphylactic shock, some of you guys may have heard of what's called the EpiPen, right? Well, the EpiPen involves an injection of epinephrine. And what does epinephrine do? That counteracts the effect of anaphylactic shock. So for example, if our bronchi are constricted, this epinephrine will cause the bronchioles to dilate. If our heart rate slows down, what we call hypotension, low blood pressure, epinephrine will increase the heart rate. Don't worry right now about these beta 1 and beta 2 receptors. Just know that epi will stimulate the heart rate, will dilate the bronchioles, which will improve the symptoms associated with anaphylactic shock. All right. All right, so the final frontier here is the parasympathetic. So now let's take a look at the specifics of the parasympathetic. Remember, parasympathetic is cranial. Actually, it only shows the cranial nerves. I think the sacral on the other page. Cranial sacral nerves are part of the parasympathetic system. This is what we call the rest and digest, which is the opposite effect of the fight or flight. This involves, so what does this mean in terms of the neurotransmitters? Well, the preganglionic neurons produce acetylcholine, which is exactly what we saw with the sympathetic. The difference lies in what neurotransmitters are produced by the postganglionic. And in the case of the postganglionic, they also produce acetylcholine. So we have acetylcholine with pre, acetylcholine with post, whereas sympathetic, we have acetylcholine with pre, norepinephrine with post. All right, so this is just kind of showing, again, the relationship. Here we've got the parasympathetic, remember, has a very long pre, short post. Long pre, short post. And it involves cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10, and the sacral region. Obviously, this right here, remember, this middle area would be where the sympathetic nerves are. All right, so I want to kind of highlight a little bit one interesting aspect of the parasympathetic system. Remember, one of the nerves we spoke about, one of the cranial nerves, was the vagus nerve, which is cranial nerve 10. This is a nerve that involves almost every aspect of our viscera, of our target organs. It's often called the wanderer. That's just a nickname for it, because if you follow where it is, cranial nerve 10, it's involved in controlling the heart, the lungs, the digestive system, as well as the bladder and the reproductive system. So just know that cranial nerve 10 is the wanderer, and it has a lot of different effects. You guys may be familiar with the whole gut-brain relationship, the gut-brain connection. Well, the vagus nerve plays a very important role in that, in the sense that quite often what's going on in your gut, if you've got gastric distress or whatever, is conveyed back to the brain by way of that vagus nerve. All right. So there's a couple other, okay. So where I'm pretty much going to end up is this point. There's a few other slides coming up, but we're not going to, I don't think, get into those. I just want to finish up here. And this is obviously the most significant thing. With all this information about neurons, how big they are, what neurotransmitter they're producing, what exactly are the sympathetic and parasympathetic doing, right? Well, we know that the sympathetic is fight or flight. We know that the parasympathetic is rest and digest. So let's start with the fight or flight. If you think about it, when you're in a fight or flight situation, that means your body is perceiving some sort of confrontation. This doesn't have to be a physical confrontation. It can be something that's challenging. You could have this type of reaction to getting an expensive phone bill, right? Whatever it is, your body perceives you're in a fight or flight situation. So if you think about that, first thing to think about, I would think, is skeletal muscle. We think of fight or flight, think of running, right? We're either getting away from a situation, which quite often we can't, or we're confronting it. We're moving towards it. If we think about muscle, in order for muscles to be activated, we need to get nutrients and we need to get oxygen to them, right? So how is this possible? Well, by two main systems, the respiratory and the cardiovascular. So in order to get more blood, basically more nutrients and oxygen to the target organs, we need to increase the heart rate and the force of contraction of the heart. So the heart beats stronger and it beats faster to deliver more blood, primarily to the skeletal muscles. Well, it's really what's in that blood that's important, right? We want a lot of oxygen. So while this is going on, our bronchioles, which are these tubes, right, over here, are dilating, allowing more oxygen to get to the lungs. Once the oxygen gets to the lungs, it can go into the blood and then deliver oxygen to the tissue, to the skeletal muscle. One aspect also about the sympathetic system is we're on a kind of an alert phase, like an alarm, right? If you've ever noticed, sometimes you're very alert focused. This system also causes pupil dilation. Your pupils will dilate. While we're seeing this increase in delivery of oxygen, right, and increased blood flow and oxygen to the skeletal muscle, we can't activate everything. So when we're increasing blood flow to muscle, we need to divert it away from other areas. And one of those areas that we divert it away from is primarily the digestive system and also the urinary system. We divert blood away from, because the last thing on your mind when you're stressed is eating. Now, some people are stress eaters. But typically at least with me, the last thing on my mind is I want to eat. I don't want to eat, right? So the blood is diverted, the nutrients are diverted away from the gut and they go right to the muscle. So the key thing to recognize here is the goal of the sympathetic is to get the oxygen, get those nutrients to the skeletal muscle, divert it away from other areas, increase our alertness, right? Now, as far as reproduction, this is kind of a whole other ball of wax. We'll talk about that under the reproductive system, but it also promotes ejaculation. What about the rest and digest? Well, you can take basically what we saw with the sympathetic, and do the exact opposite. Parasympathetic, primarily through acetylcholine, right? Because that's what's going to the target organs. We'll see a decrease in heart rate and blood pressure, kind of slows the heart down, reduces the uptake of oxygen. The pupils constrict. And this is where, we call it rest and digest. This is where our digestive system is kicking into high gear, right? We're more blood flow, more secretions from our digestive tract. Even our salivary glands are active. Have you ever noticed when you're stressed, you get dry mouth? That's because the sympathetic system reduces the activity of the salivary glands, which are part of the digestive system. So we're able to digest. We're able to pee. Although, again, sometimes people, when they're stressed, they kind of squirt out a little pee, but that's more of a reflex as opposed to an actual action. So you think of just rest and digest. So when we sit down to eat a meal, this should be what's going on, right? Of course, unfortunately, sometimes when we're eating a meal, we're in a rush. This is activated, and then our digestion is not very good. And then finally, we have erection, sexual arousal. We'll again talk about these with the reproductive system. All right. I'm not going to cover that, but the last slide I do want to cover is this one, just to show you kind of an example of how the sympathetic, parasympathetic work. Remember, in terms of blood pressure, remember I mentioned that parasympathetic slows down heart rate, reduces the activity of the heart. Here's a perfect example where if the heart is activated, right, this triggers the activation of these parasympathetic nerves. So when the blood pressure goes up, it sends information to the cranial nerves. Many of them, such as the vagus and others, they come down and they end up slowing down the heart rate. So basically, that's kind of what's going on here. I'm not going to cover this. This is kind of a lot. I cover this more in physiology. So let me go ahead. Having said that, I'm going to go ahead and stop the share. So I'm going to go ahead and end the lecture now. I know it's kind of getting late. What I'm going to do is I've got this recorded, so you'll get a copy of this. I'm also going to record going over the study guide, what you guys should focus on, and I will send that out as well. So does anybody have any questions at this point? Let's see.
No.
Yes. Oh, you don't? No? Was that Joseph?
No.
Okay. Did someone have a question? Anybody? No?
No.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this. Like I said, I'll send you a copy. I'll also make a copy of the review. I hope to sometime today be sending you out how to get started with the nervous system lab. All right. So you guys have a good day.
How will it work on Monday for the test?
Okay, I'll send that out to you. So basically, it's going to be the same. See, Monday is the 13th. So we will not have a regular lecture. So I will put the exam up, and you'll have I mean, it'll start the same time as our normal lecture would, but you'll have some extra time.
Okay.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. So if there's no other questions, you'll probably be, the next time you'll be hearing from me is through email, or you'll see the video. And have a good rest of the, what's today, Wednesday? Yeah, have a good rest of the week. Talk to you guys later.
Thank you.